Tartarian Empire. In the 1800s, European maps labeled a massive territory spanning from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean with a single name, Tartary. It covered 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. By 1920, that name had been completely erased from every map on Earth. Tartary wasn't a myth. It appeared on official maps from France, Britain, Spain, and Russia for over 300 years. Encyclopedias described its cities, its people, its culture, and then suddenly, it was gone. Not conquered, not renamed, just deleted. The buildings remain. Across Russia, Central Asia, and Siberia, there are thousands of structures with architectural sophistication that seems impossible for nomadic tribes to have built. Cathedrals with perfect acoustics, star forts with geometric precision, underground cities that could house tens of thousands. Official history calls them Russian architecture, or attributes them to European colonizers. But many of these structures existed before Russia expanded east. Some predate the supposed builders by centuries. The architectural style is consistent, and it's found nowhere else in the world. In the early 1900s, a global event called the Great Reset, or Mud Flood, is referenced in hundreds of newspaper articles. Buildings buried to their second floors, cities excavated from beneath meters of mud, populations displaced. And when reconstruction began, the maps were redrawn. Tartary disappeared from those new maps. The land was divided into Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and China. The buildings were claimed by the new governments. The history was rewritten, and an empire that had existed for centuries became a footnote, then vanished entirely. Why? Because Tartary represented an advanced civilization that didn't fit the narrative of primitive East versus enlightened West. Its technology, architecture, and knowledge challenged the idea that Europe alone had been the center of progress. Photographs from the 1800s show Tartarian cities with advanced infrastructure, paved roads, electric streetlights, water systems, and massive public buildings. Yet history books tell us these regions were uncivilized until European colonization. The photos say otherwise. In 1876, a World's Fair in Philadelphia featured a Tartarian pavilion. Visitors described it as one of the most impressive displays. Photos exist, records exist. But modern encyclopedias don't mention Tartary's participation. It's as if an entire nation exhibited at a world event and was erased. The official explanation. Tartary was just a generic term Europeans used for Central Asia. But that doesn't explain why it had defined borders, a flag, government structures, and appeared on maps as a sovereign territory for 300 years. When the Soviet Union formed, one of its first actions was to destroy or repurpose thousands of old world buildings. Cathedrals became warehouses, palaces became prisons, and the architectural records linking them to pre-Russian civilization were systematically destroyed. Even the name was scrubbed from language. Books printed before 1920 that mentioned Tartary were burned, edited, or removed from circulation. Libraries that held maps of Tartary had those maps pulled from public access. The erasure was deliberate and thorough. Today, asking about Tartary online gets you labeled a conspiracy theorist. Yet the maps are real. The encyclopedias are real. The buildings are real. The photographs are real. What's not real is the explanation for why all of it was erased. Some researchers believe Tartary was destroyed by a cataclysmic event, possibly man-made, that reset global civilization in the 1800s. Others believe it was simply too powerful, too advanced, and too inconvenient for the colonial powers redrawing the world. The buildings that remain tell a story official history refuses to acknowledge. They show a level of engineering, energy distribution, and urban planning that shouldn't exist in primitive regions. Free energy systems, harmonic resonance chambers, technology we still don't fully understand. Tartary was erased because remembering it would mean admitting that history, as we were taught, is a lie. That advanced civilizations existed outside Europe. That a global reset happened within living memory. And that we're living in the aftermath of a world we were never meant to remember. Aksumite Empire. Between 100 AD and 940 AD, an empire in the Horn of Africa controlled trade routes spanning 3 continents. It minted its own currency, built monumental obelisks that still stand today, and was mentioned alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world. Its name was Aksum, and despite controlling the Red Sea trade for 800 years, despite being a major player in global commerce, despite influencing the spread of Christianity across Africa and Arabia, most people have never heard of it. The Aksumite Empire wasn't discovered by Europeans. It was deliberately omitted from their history books, because acknowledging a black African empire that rivaled Rome would have undermined the entire justification for colonization, that Africa had no civilizations worth preserving. At its height, Aksum was one of the wealthiest empires on Earth. It controlled the trade of gold, ivory, incense, and exotic animals between Africa, India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Roman merchants traveled there. Persian diplomats negotiated with it. It was a superpower. The Aksumites built massive stone obelisks, some over 100 feet tall, carved from single blocks of granite, weighing hundreds of tons. Modern engineers still debate how they were transported and erected. The precision rivals anything in Egypt or Rome. Yet they're barely mentioned in world history. Aksum was also one of the first Christian kingdoms in the world, converting in 330 AD, decades before much of Europe. Its churches are architectural marvels, carved directly into mountainsides. Some are still in use today, over 1,500 years later. The empire had its own written script, Ge'ez, which is still used in Ethiopia today. It had sophisticated agricultural systems, advanced metallurgy, and a navy that controlled Red Sea shipping. It even invaded and conquered parts of Arabia, including modern-day Yemen. In the 6th century, Aksum was powerful enough that the Byzantine Empire asked for its military help. The Aksumite king launched a campaign across the Red Sea, defeated the ruling powers in Yemen, and established Aksumite control over the Arabian Peninsula's southern trade routes. So why was it erased? Because European colonial narratives required Africa to be uncivilized before European arrival. An advanced African empire that had traded with Rome, controlled international commerce, and built monumental architecture destroyed that narrative. When Italian colonizers arrived in Ethiopia in the 1800s, they tried to claim Aksum's monuments were built by foreign colonizers or lost white tribes. The idea that black Africans could have built them was considered impossible, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Even after Ethiopia defeated Italy in the Battle of Adwa in 1896, one of the only African nations to successfully resist colonization, Western historians continued to minimize or ignore Aksumite achievements. The empire was too inconvenient to acknowledge. Aksum's decline began in the 7th century, when Islamic expansion cut off its trade routes. But the kingdom didn't vanish. It transformed into the Ethiopian Empire, which survived until 1974. The continuity of culture, language, and religion spans over 2,000 years. The Ark of the Covenant, the biblical artifact lost to history, is claimed by Ethiopian Christians to reside in Aksum, in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. Whether true or not, the claim itself shows how central Aksum was to early Christian history. Today, most world history courses skip from ancient Egypt to European colonization, as if nothing happened in Africa for 2,000 years. Aksum is the proof that narrative is a lie. It was a superpower. It just wasn't a European one. The stelae of Aksum, those towering obelisks, were so impressive that Italy looted one in 1937 and displayed it in Rome as a symbol of their conquest. It wasn't returned to Ethiopia until 2005. For 68 years, Europe kept physical evidence of African achievement as a trophy. Aksum was erased not because it fell in battle, but because remembering it would force a reckoning with history. It would mean admitting Africa had empires, wealth, engineering, and culture long before Europe ever arrived. That truth was too dangerous to teach. Khmer Empire. In the jungles of Cambodia lies the largest religious monument ever built. Angkor Wat covers over 400 acres. Its temple complex spans 1,000 square kilometers. At its peak, it was the heart of an empire that ruled over 1 million people, larger than any European city at the time. The Khmer Empire lasted from 802 AD to 1431 AD. It controlled most of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and parts of Vietnam. It built over 1,000 temples, developed advanced hydraulic engineering, created a water management system so sophisticated it sustained a megacity in the jungle. Angkor was the largest pre-industrial city in the world, bigger than Rome at its height. Yet most history books skip from ancient China to European colonization as if Southeast Asia had no civilizations worth mentioning. The Khmer Empire is barely a footnote. Why? Because when French colonizers discovered Angkor Wat in the 1860s, they couldn't believe indigenous people had built it. They invented stories of lost Roman colonies or ancient Europeans who had traveled to Asia and built the temples for the primitive natives. The Khmer built a water management system that modern engineers still study. They created massive reservoirs called barrays that captured monsoon rains and distributed water year-round. These artificial lakes were kilometers long and fed an irrigation network supporting 1 million people. Angkor Wat itself was designed with astronomical precision. Its layout mirrors the constellation Draco. Its dimensions encode the Hindu calendar. Its walls align with solar and lunar cycles. This level of knowledge shouldn't exist in a culture Europeans labeled uncivilized. The Khmer also mastered stone construction on a scale few civilizations ever achieved. They transported stones weighing several tons from quarries 50 kilometers away, through jungle across rivers, using methods that remain unclear. No wheels, no draft animals capable of pulling that weight. Yet the stones arrived. By the 12th century, Angkor was a thriving metropolis with paved roads, hospitals, schools, and markets. Its temples were covered in gold. Chinese merchants traveled there and described it as the wealthiest city they had ever seen. It was a center of art, culture, and religious scholarship. So what happened? Around 1431, Angkor fell to invading Thai forces. But the city wasn't destroyed. It was abandoned. Theories suggest environmental collapse, overuse of resources, or shifts in trade routes. The jungle reclaimed it within decades. When the French arrived in the 1860s, Angkor Wat was overgrown, nearly invisible beneath centuries of vegetation. Local people knew it was there. They had never forgotten. But Europeans treated its discovery as if the civilization itself had never existed before they found it. French archaeologists immediately began claiming the Khmer couldn't have built Angkor. The precision was too great, the engineering too advanced. They suggested Romans, Greeks, or even Atlanteans, anything except acknowledging Southeast Asian ingenuity. This erasure wasn't accidental. Colonialism required the narrative that non-European people were incapable of civilization. Angkor Wat, proof of indigenous brilliance, had to be explained away or attributed to outsiders. The Khmer achievement had to be stolen. In the early 1900s, colonial France promoted Angkor Wat in their propaganda. Not to honor Cambodia, but to justify French rule. They claimed they were restoring a civilization Cambodians couldn't maintain. The empire was acknowledged, then used as justification for colonization. The Khmer Empire's decline is taught as inevitable collapse due to primitive resource management. But recent studies show they adapted to climate change for centuries. What actually destroyed them wasn't incompetence, it was war, invasion, and external pressures. Today, Angkor Wat is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a symbol of Cambodian pride. But in Western education, the Khmer Empire is still reduced to the people who built that one temple. Their hydraulic engineering, their urban planning, their cultural achievements, erased. The Khmer Empire wasn't forgotten, it was deliberately minimized, because admitting that Southeast Asia built the largest pre-industrial city on Earth, with engineering that rivals anything in Europe, would require rewriting the entire colonial narrative, so they buried it in the jungle. Again. Great Zimbabwe. In the 11th century, in what is now Zimbabwe, a civilization built a city entirely from stone, not mud bricks, not wood. Precisely cut granite blocks fitted together without mortar. Walls 36 feet high and 15 feet thick. The largest ancient structure south of the Sahara. Great Zimbabwe housed up to 18,000 people at its peak. It controlled gold and ivory trade routes connecting inland Africa to the Indian Ocean. Arab merchants traveled there. Chinese porcelain has been found in its ruins. It was a commercial powerhouse, and it was built by Black Africans. When European colonizers encountered Great Zimbabwe in the 1800s, they faced a problem. The architecture was too sophisticated, the engineering too precise, the city too large, It contradicted everything they had told themselves about Africa being primitive and uncivilized. So they lied. British archaeologist J. Theodore Bent declared in 1891 that Great Zimbabwe must have been built by Phoenicians, Arabs, or a lost white civilization. Africans, he claimed, were incapable of such construction. His conclusion became official colonial policy. The Rhodesian government, the white minority regime that ruled Zimbabwe, made it illegal to suggest that black Africans had built Great Zimbabwe. Archaeologists who contradicted the official narrative lost their jobs. Books were banned, evidence was suppressed. For decades, the site was vandalized by treasure hunters and colonial authorities searching for proof of foreign builders. They destroyed stratigraphy, removed artifacts, and disrupted archaeological context, making it harder for future researchers to prove indigenous construction. The architecture itself told the truth. Great Zimbabwe's dry stone walls use a technique found nowhere else in the world except southern Africa. The style matches other Shona ruins in the region. The pottery, tools, and cultural artifacts are all indigenous. There was never any mystery. Great Zimbabwe wasn't just impressive architecture, it was the capital of a vast trading empire. Gold from Zimbabwe reached as far as China. The kingdom controlled the flow of wealth from the African interior to the coast. It was rich, powerful, and sophisticated. By the 15th century, Great Zimbabwe declined, likely due to overgrazing, deforestation, or shifts in trade routes. The population dispersed to other settlements. But the civilization didn't vanish. The Shona people who built it are still there. The culture continues. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, the new nation took its name from Great Zimbabwe, reclaiming the heritage that had been stolen. But even today, fringe theorists continue to deny African authorship, inventing ancient astronauts, lost Atlanteans, or anything except the truth. The refusal to credit black Africans with Great Zimbabwe reveals the purpose of historical erasure, to justify colonization. If Africans had built cities, controlled trade, and created monumental architecture, then colonialism couldn't be framed as bringing civilization to the uncivilized. Modern archaeology has definitively proven Great Zimbabwe was built by the Shona people between the 11th and 15th centuries. Carbon dating, artifact analysis, and architectural studies all confirm it. The only people who disputed this were those with political reasons to deny it. Great Zimbabwe's decline is often taught as evidence of African inability to sustain civilizations. But the same environmental factors affected societies worldwide. Rome fell, Angkor fell, Easter Island fell. Only African collapses are used to justify claims of inherent inferiority. The walls of Great Zimbabwe still stand. They've survived centuries without mortar, earthquakes, and weather. The engineering is flawless, the craftsmanship undeniable. And yet, as recently as the 1970s, textbooks were still attributing it to foreign builders. In 2024, Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but the damage has been done. Generations were taught that Africans couldn't build stone cities. That narrative, even when disproven, lingers. The lie has outlived the truth. Great Zimbabwe was erased, not because there was any doubt about who built it, but because the truth was unacceptable. Admitting African engineering excellence meant admitting colonialism was built on lies. So the evidence was buried, the builders erased, and the empire forgotten. Srivijaya Empire. For over 600 years, from the 7th to the 13th century, a Buddhist maritime empire controlled the most valuable trade route in the world, the Strait of Malacca. Every ship carrying spices, silk, and gold between China and India had to pass through waters controlled by Srivijaya. At its height, Srivijaya ruled over modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and parts of the Philippines. It commanded a navy powerful enough to tax international trade. It built Buddhist universities that attracted scholars from across Asia. And most people have never heard of it. Srivijaya wasn't discovered in ruins. It was documented by Chinese and Arab travelers who visited its ports, traded with its merchants, and studied at its monasteries. Their records describe a wealthy, sophisticated civilization. Yet Western history treats it as if it never existed. Why? Because Srivijaya's power came from controlling trade routes, not from territorial conquest. It didn't build massive stone monuments. It didn't leave pyramids or palaces. Its wealth was in ships, knowledge, and commerce, things that don't survive millennia. The empire's capital was likely near modern-day Palembang in Sumatra, but because it was built on stilts over water, a common design in maritime Southeast Asia, almost nothing remains. The wood rotted, the structures sank, the physical evidence disappeared. What didn't disappear were the written records. Chinese monk Yi Jing studied at Srivijaya's Buddhist university in the 7th century and wrote detailed accounts. He described a city of 1,000 monks, vast libraries, and advanced scholarship. His texts are still preserved in China. Arab geographer al-Biruni mentioned Srivijaya in the 11th century as one of the great powers of the East. Marco Polo referenced it. Javanese inscriptions describe wars with Srivijaya. The empire was well known across Asia. Only Europe ignored it. Srivijaya's decline began in the 11th century when the Chola Empire from southern India launched naval raids that weakened its control. By the 13th century, the rise of the Majapahit Empire in Java and shifts in trade routes ended Srivijaya's dominance. When European colonizers arrived in Southeast Asia in the 16th century, Srivijaya was already gone. Since there were no ruins to discover, Europeans assumed the region had always been divided into small, weak kingdoms. The idea of a unified maritime superpower was dismissed. It wasn't until the 1920s that European scholars finally acknowledged Srivijaya's existence, and only because French archaeologist Georges Codès translated the inscriptions that had been sitting in museums for decades. Even then, it was treated as a minor footnote. Srivijaya's erasure is a case study in historical bias. Western history prioritizes land empires with visible monuments. Maritime empires, nomadic confederations, and trade-based powers are dismissed as less civilized, even when they controlled global commerce. The empire's influence shaped Southeast Asian culture for centuries. Malay language spread through Srivijayan trade networks. Buddhism became dominant across the region because of Srivijayan monasteries. The cultural legacy is undeniable, but the empire itself? Barely mentioned. Modern Indonesia barely teaches Srivijaya in schools. Colonial Dutch education focused on European history and diminished indigenous achievements. Even after independence, the lack of physical ruins made it easy to ignore compared to Java's temple complexes. Recent underwater archaeology has begun finding evidence, shipwrecks, port structures, and artifacts in the waters around Sumatra. These discoveries confirm what the texts always said. Srivijaya was real, powerful, and sophisticated. It just didn't build in stone. The Strait of Malacca is still one of the world's most important shipping routes. Every year, trillions of dollars in goods pass through the same waters Srivijaya controlled 1,000 years ago. The empire that once taxed the world's trade is forgotten by the world it enriched. Srivijaya was erased not by conquest, but by the assumption that civilizations without pyramids don't matter. That maritime power is less legitimate than territorial conquest. That trade-based empires are footnotes. History was written by land empires. Srivijaya controlled the sea. Nubian Kingdoms. In 747 BC, a Nubian king named Pa marched north from the kingdom of Kush and conquered Egypt. For the next century, black African pharaohs ruled the entire Nile Valley. They were the 25th dynasty, and their reign has been systematically erased from history. Nubia, modern-day Sudan, was one of Africa's oldest civilizations. It had pyramids, more than Egypt, gold mines that funded empires, and a military powerful enough to defeat Egypt multiple times. Yet most people think ancient Egypt was the only major civilization along the Nile. The erasure began with the Egyptians themselves. After the Nubians were expelled by Assyrian invasion in 656 BC, later Egyptian dynasties defaced Nubian monuments, chiseled their names off statues, and omitted them from king lists. The goal was to erase evidence of African rule. When European archaeologists arrived in the 1800s, they found Nubian pyramids, temples, and royal tombs, clear proof of an advanced civilization. But acknowledging black Africans as the equals or superiors of Egyptians contradicted racial theories justifying colonization, so they invented explanations. Nubians were imitating Egypt. Their pyramids were crude copies. Their culture was derivative. Every achievement was framed as inferior borrowing from Egypt, even though Nubian civilization was just as old, and in some periods more powerful. The truth is that Nubia and Egypt had a complex relationship spanning 3,000 years. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they fought, sometimes they ruled each other. Nubians weren't imitators. They were rivals, equals, and at times, conquerors. The 25th dynasty pharaohs styled themselves as the true heirs of Egyptian tradition. They restored old temples, revived ancient religious practices, and presented themselves as defenders of Egypt's heritage against foreign invaders. They weren't destroyers, they were preservers. King Taharka, one of the most powerful Nubian pharaohs, is mentioned in the Bible. He allied with the kingdom of Judah against the Assyrian Empire. He built monuments across Egypt and Nubia. His reign is documented in both African and Middle Eastern sources. Yet most history courses never mention him. After the Assyrian invasion, the Nubian pharaohs retreated south to Kush and continued ruling for another 1,000 years. They built new pyramids, maintained trade networks, and remained a regional power until the 4th century AD. But that part of the story is almost never taught. In modern depictions of ancient Egypt, movies, textbooks, museums, pharaohs are almost always portrayed as lighter-skinned. The 25th dynasty is either omitted entirely or shown as a brief, anomalous foreign interlude. Their African identity is minimized or erased. Nubia had over 200 pyramids, more than Egypt. They had a written language, Meroitic script, advanced ironworking, and monumental architecture. Yet when people think of pyramids, they think of Egypt. Nubia has been reduced to a footnote in Egypt's story. The erasure serves a purpose. If Black Africans ruled Egypt, the civilization Europeans considered the pinnacle of ancient achievement, it undermines the narrative that Africa was uncivilized before European contact. Nubia had to be forgotten. In 2003, archaeologist Charles Bonnet discovered a massive Nubian city called Kerma, dating to 2500 BC, contemporary with Egypt's Old Kingdom. The findings proved Nubia was an independent, sophisticated civilization, not an Egyptian colony. The discovery received minimal media coverage. Modern Sudan, the heir to ancient Nubia, is one of the poorest countries on Earth. Civil war, famine, and instability have made archaeological work difficult. The pyramids and temples are crumbling, underprotected, and largely ignored by international preservation efforts. In 2020, after decades of neglect, UNESCO finally recognized Sudan's pyramids as a World Heritage Site. But by then, many had already been damaged by treasure hunters, erosion, and lack of funding. The physical evidence of Nubia's greatness is slowly disappearing. The Nubian kingdoms weren't erased by conquest. They were erased by omission, distortion, and neglect. Acknowledging their power, their achievements, and their rule over Egypt would require rewriting the entire narrative of African history. So instead, they were forgotten. Lemuria. In 1864, a French scholar named Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg translated an ancient Mayan text. In it, he found references to a land that sank beneath the ocean in a single catastrophic event. The text called it Mu, and it matched flood myths from dozens of cultures around the world. Polynesians tell stories of a vast continent in the Pacific that was destroyed by the gods. Easter Island's oral tradition speaks of a larger homeland that sank. Japanese legends mention Mu. Tamil texts from India describe Kumari Kondam, a sunken landmass in the Indian Ocean. All different names, all describing the same thing. In the 1870s, British zoologist Philip Sclater noticed something strange. Lemurs existed in Madagascar and India, but not in Africa or the Middle East between them. He proposed a land bridge, which he named Lemuria, that once connected them before sinking beneath the Indian Ocean. Geologists dismissed the idea. Continental drift and plate tectonics explained animal distribution without sunken continents. But the legends persisted, and the archaeological evidence, massive underwater structures, unexplained ruins on remote islands, kept appearing. In 1986, Japanese divers discovered a massive submerged structure off the coast of Yonaguni Island. Straight edges, right angles, terraced platforms, stairways carved into rock. Geologists debated whether it was natural or man-made. It remains underwater, 100 feet down, unexplained. In 2001, Indian researchers found submerged ruins in the Gulf of Cambay using sonar. Artifacts recovered from the site were carbon dated to 9,500 years old, predating all known civilizations. The Indian government briefly acknowledged it, then stopped discussing it. Easter Island's Moai statues weigh up to 80 tons and were transported miles across the island, using methods that remain disputed. The island's population at its peak couldn't have numbered more than a few thousand, yet they carved and moved nearly 1,000 statues. How? Easter Island oral history claims the statues were walked into place by priests using mana, spiritual power. Modern researchers dismiss this as myth, but the statues exist. They were moved, and no one has successfully replicated the process at scale. The Rongorongo script of Easter Island is one of only a few independent writing systems ever developed. It's never been deciphered. The last person who could read it died in the 1860s. What knowledge was lost when that language vanished? Mu and Lemuria are dismissed as pseudoscience today. But the flood myths aren't pseudoscience. The underwater structures aren't pseudoscience. The unexplained ruins on Pacific Islands aren't pseudoscience. Something happened. Whether it was a continent or an advanced maritime culture, something was lost. Sea levels were 400 feet lower during the last ice age, which ended around 11,000 years ago. Massive coastal areas where civilizations tend to develop are now underwater. If advanced cultures existed then, their cities would be submerged, and we wouldn't know. Mainstream archaeology refuses to search for pre-Ice Age civilizations because it contradicts the timeline. Civilization supposedly began 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Anything earlier is dismissed. But the carbon dating of underwater ruins keeps producing older dates. In 2018, researchers found evidence of human activity in North America dating to 130,000 years ago. Over 100,000 years before humans were supposed to be there. The findings were attacked, dismissed, and buried, because accepting them would mean rewriting human history. Mu and Lemuria may not have been continents, but the idea that advanced Pacific cultures existed and were destroyed by rising sea levels or catastrophic events is not far-fetched. It's geology, it's archaeology, it's oral history from dozens of independent sources. The refusal to seriously investigate is what's suspicious, not the legends themselves. Thousands of cultures don't independently invent the same flood story. They remember an event, and if that event destroyed a civilization, it would explain the gaps in our timeline. Mu was erased not by the ocean, but by academia's refusal to consider it. The underwater structures are ignored, the flood myths are dismissed, the archaeological anomalies are explained away, because admitting a pre-Mesopotamian Pacific civilization existed would shatter the foundation of recorded history. Land of Punt. For over 1,000 years, ancient Egyptians recorded trade expeditions to a place they called Ta-Netjer, the land of the gods. They brought back gold, ivory, ebony, myrrh, and frankincense. Egyptian texts describe it as a wealthy, sophisticated kingdom. Its name was Punt, and no one knows where it was. Punt appears in Egyptian records from 2500 BC to 1000 BC. Pharaohs sent fleets of ships to trade there. Queen Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari has detailed carvings showing an expedition to Punt, complete with images of the people, their houses, and the goods they traded. The carvings show Puntites as black Africans with distinct facial features and clothing. Their homes were built on stilts, they raised cattle, they grew frankincense trees. The depictions are so detailed that archaeologists should be able to identify the location. Yet it remains lost. Most scholars place Punt somewhere along the Red Sea coast, either modern Eritrea, Somalia, or Yemen. But others argue it could have been deeper in Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, or even Zimbabwe. The evidence points in multiple directions. Conveniently, none can be definitively proven. Why is the location of a kingdom that traded with Egypt for 1,500 years still unknown? Because acknowledging Punt's exact location would mean acknowledging an advanced Black African civilization that was Egypt's trading partner and cultural equal. That's inconvenient for colonial narratives. Genetic studies of mummified baboons from Egypt trace their origins to Eritrea and Ethiopia, suggesting Punt was in the Horn of Africa. But even with genetic evidence narrowing the location, the academic consensus remains, we just don't know. The uncertainty is strategic. Punt wasn't just a trade partner, it was a source of goods Egyptians considered sacred. Myrrh and frankincense were used in religious ceremonies. Gold came from Punt. The goods weren't exotic curiosities, they were essential to Egyptian religion and economy. Queen Hatshepsut's expedition to Punt around 1470 BC is one of the best documented trade missions in ancient history. The temple carvings show 5 ships, describe the voyage, and list the goods exchanged. It's a detailed historical record. Yet Punt remains a mystery. In the 1800s, when European scholars first studied these texts, they couldn't reconcile land of the gods with their assumptions about Africa. So they theorized Punt must have been in Arabia, or India, or even mythical. Anywhere but Black Africa. Modern archaeology has found no ruins definitively labeled Punt because no one is seriously looking for them. Expeditions to the Horn of Africa and Sudan are underfunded. The region is politically unstable, and there's no institutional incentive to find evidence that contradicts established narratives. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Punt cities could be buried, underwater, or simply unexcavated. But the lack of discovery is used to imply Punt never existed as a significant civilization, just a vague trading region. Punt is described in Egyptian texts as a real place with real people, real rulers, and real trade relationships, yet it's treated like Atlantis, a myth, a legend, a lost civilization. The difference? Atlantis was invented by Plato. Punt is documented in hundreds of Egyptian inscriptions. In 2010, researchers published a study pinpointing Punt to modern-day Eritrea based on baboon DNA, trade goods, and navigational records. The findings were published in a reputable journal. Media coverage was minimal. No major expeditions followed. The matter was quietly dropped. Punt's erasure serves the same purpose as every empire on this list, to minimize non-European civilizations. If Punt was a wealthy, sophisticated African kingdom that traded as an equal with Egypt for 1,500 years, it undermines the narrative that Africa had no great civilizations. The goods from Punt, frankincense, myrrh, gold, ebony, ivory, were so valuable that Egyptians called them God's land products. This wasn't a primitive backwater. This was a wealthy, organized state capable of sustaining long-distance trade for over a millennium. Punt was erased by calling it lost, by refusing to fund expeditions, by downplaying its significance, by keeping it a mystery when the evidence clearly points to East Africa. Because finding Punt would mean admitting that African kingdoms were trading empires, cultural centers, and equals to Egypt. And that truth was never supposed to be found.